Greetings, saxophone people. I'm going to do something a little bit different today. Usually, I just make videos demonstrating horns and mouthpieces, things that I restore, stuff that I'm selling, stuff that I'm enjoying. Sometimes it's just stuff that I'm selling, and sometimes it's just for educational purposes or for fun. But today, I'm just going to talk a little bit because I deal with a lot of people who, like me, are into vintage horns and mouthpieces and things like that. And I usually just keep to myself. I'm just into my horns and restoring stuff, and hunting for stuff to restore. And other than that, I just practice on my own and whatever. And I'm not really trying to do a big public shop and all that. But I have been involved with vintage horns and mouthpieces for some decades. And I saw a video on YouTube with somebody, giving advice and, telling people how it was and all that. And I had quite a few thoughts about that and some disagreements. And I think it's high time that maybe I should share some of my experience and ideas. Normally I don't really care, but today I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna start that, and we'll see what happens. But the video was talking about what is the best horn in the world and that kind of thing, and then it went on to a big thing about the Mark VI, and the many criticisms of the Mark VI and how it's not all it's cracked up to be, and blah 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 blah. And so I think because I deal with a lot of people who are looking for vintage Mark VIs. And I look for them, and I enjoy them, and I talk to a lot of people about that stuff and help people find horns and all that. I'm not out here to hype and pump the Mark VI or any other horn. I mean, I don't personally care because I didn't get into this to be in business. I just got into it because I like doing it. But I want to clarify because I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about the Mark VI, the magical Mark VI and all that. I mean, those of us, I probably got into this, sometime in the mid to late 1980s, finding vintage horns and learning about them. And there's a lot to learn, actually. And it seems like people now who sort of got into that game quite a bit later, recently, it's very difficult because back then, of course, if you wanted to hunt for vintage horns back then, you could go to a shop. There was a lot of, at least in the U.S., in various cities, there were a lot of brass and woodwind shops, and you could walk in there, and they'd have vintage horns just lined up on the wall, and you could just take your pick and try all kinds of things. And, you could play stuff and just write in there and, get a sense of what it was about, what kind of condition it was in, and you could get a picture of stuff. Now it's very difficult because everything, went to the internet, and then because it was on the internet, it was internationally available, and so all the Asians and from various countries in Korea and China and Japan, and they started buying them internationally. The price went up, and now they're collector's items, and they're very hard. You can't just walk into any local shop. There aren't hardly any local shops, but most places you can't just walk in and they have a bunch of vintage Selmers or Kings or whatever lined up on the wall that you can play. You don't have that anymore because those things have all been, people have realized, and they've kept them and they put them on eBay and wherever else, to sell them, and it's different. So now people just don't have that direct local access to the horns. So if you got into it late, past the internet time period, you didn't get to go try a lot of things. You would have had to pony up a lot of money. If you wanted to try something, you had to pony up money and buy it from a distance and hope that it works for you and hope that it's good, and often it's not, and then you got to try and get rid of it without, losing your money and all that. It's just a lot more risky, it's a lot more troublesome, and so a lot of people who got into it late don't really understand. They don't have enough experience to have tried tons of things to understand what it's all about, and they try a few things and then they make up their mind, and that's that. And then some people get bitter and sort of disgruntled because, it's too expensive, they don't get to try it, or they did make take a shot and bought some vintage thing and spent a lot of money. It turned out to be a piece of junk. They didn't like it. They're mad. They got scammed. They sold it. They lost their money. They think it's all a big racket, and I understand that. There's difficulty associated with that. But let's look at a little bit of reality here. This is from a person who's been into vintage Selmers and Kings and other horns since the 1980s, and I'm just going to share my opinions. And if people don't like it, tough luck. So what? That's what it is. So I saw this recent video, and they're hyping the Mark VI. They're talking about the overhyped Mark VI and all the faults and all the flaws and how it's not really that good and all that. And I'll put the link to the video. But one guy, and I mean, these guys they're doing their thing. With all due respect, they have their opinions and I have mine. And but I think it's good discussion topic. My video here is obviously this is just my little room here, a little messy room with horns and mouthpieces and tons of ligatures and junk. This is not a fancy video, but if you want to hear my ideas, here we go. So one guy said, he's talking about, he's had tons of horns and he's played a lot of horns, and and he said he had like 6 or 7 Mark VIs. And so first off, I want to say 6 or 7 Mark VIs is a tiny sample size. If you've had 6 or 7 Mark VIs, you have not had enough Mark VIs to really have a big opinion on the model run, the design changes, and the general overall thing of the Mark VI. I think I've played many hundreds of Mark VIs, maybe thousands, I don't know. Many, many, many Mark VIs. And if you've had a lot of Mark VIs and played a lot of Mark VIs, and also because I'm a repair tech and I restore them, I mean, that combined with having played and owned and tried so many of them, then you start to get an accurate picture of like what the overall thing is. What is a Mark VI, and why are they the way they are and all that. 6 to 7 horns is just not a sample size. The Mark VI had a production run of over 20 years with a lot of model changes. And you have to understand, well, there isn't a Mark VI. There are many. There are many periods of Mark VI, and they are different. They talked about how no 2 Mark VIs are the same. This is true, of course. Well, they're handmade. I mean, it was a factory, but it's like half hand assembled and half machine assembled. I mean, a lot of handwork went into them, and I mean, they're mostly handmade. The machine assisted, let's put it that way. And a lot of handwork, and no 2 horns are the same. And yes, they made a lot of design changes in bow sizes, and there are intonation changes, especially with altos. There are a lot of changes. One guy said, oh, Selmer, they made all these changes. They really didn't know what they're doing. Well, see, that to me is just, it's a bit, the statement is, I don't mean this in a bad way, but it's a little bit arrogant, meaning, or maybe just hubris is the word. It's just like, you're going to sit there and say, Selmer didn't know what they're doing. Well, we have a lot of nice horns now. There's nice new horns being made now. There are some very good ones that I like. I think the Yamaha is making a really nice horn, the 82Z and things. They're nice. There are a lot of new horns which are finally coming around to that level of the fun factor and the quality that someone like me would like. But those new horns that are being made now that we may find thrilling, I mean, their designs are based off of the Selmer Mark VI or some other early American horns. These great vintage horns, I mean, yeah, they might be quirky, right? Oh, it's not perfect. They're not consistent. They vary. They have their issues. Or this particular model year was weird, and that one was better, and that one was worse. Yeah, they have the variation. Regardless, though, to say the company didn't know what they're doing, or the technicians, the craftsmen didn't know what they were doing, is kind of silly because these guys were the innovators. I mean, we have the Yamaha 82Z now, or the 875, or the Mariottes, or whatever these horns that they're making, the Ishimori, and what these are based on the design innovations that Selmer did with the balanced action, the radio improved, the balanced action, the super action, then the Mark VIs of various types. I mean, Selmer was just innovating its way into the future. By by the seat of their pants. It's not, I mean, to say they didn't know what they were doing, well, I mean, they didn't know exactly maybe where they were going, but they were working on it, and they had a lot of experience, you know, and experimentation to sort of know how to get there, and they did. I mean, they made some great horns. And the good horns or great horns that people are now making new today are based on those innovations. In some cases, I mean, we can say, oh, are they improving on the innovations that Selmer did? Well, that's really, you know, in the eye of the beholder. I mean, you know, everyone can have an opinion on that. I mean, have they improved on the Mark VI? I don't know. I mean, there's many Mark VIs. Improved on what horn? Has anybody improved on the best Mark VI for me? Not yet. You know, there's some great horns out there, but you know, I've got a Mark VI, which is like, you know, good luck improving on that. It's pretty apex. And if somebody does, great, I'd be happy. But you know what? They improved on it because it existed already, because somebody innovated that into greatness. You know, not all Mark VIs are at that level. There's some degree of experimentation, but it's not the experimentation of idiots. It's the experimentation of master craftsmen and people that were in the business, you know, of developing technical expertise to develop improvements on the saxophone. It's not ignorant, random shot in the dark. They didn't know what they're doing. That's just not accurate. So we also have to consider with the Mark VI, with most of the Mark VIs. I mean, consider that the Mark VI started in like 1954 or something. And when you see a video of people talking about, you know, the overhyped Mark VI and how it's really not very good, blah, 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 you have to think back. I mean, 1954 was quite a while back. And the musical demands, the sonic demands, the technical demands on the instrument were completely different than they are now. If we go back to 1954, the type of mouthpieces that were in use were totally different. I mean, people used a lot of large chamber mouthpieces. The early Autolinks were very popular. And you know, generally speaking, regardless of whether it was large chamber or small chamber, the mouthpieces were different. There weren't a huge amount of high baffle mouthpieces at that time. Amplified music was not, I mean, it was like amplifiers were in their infancy. Horns were not, I mean, the sound of a saxophone was not expected to be so bright. And then on top of that, I mean, the mouthpieces, the designs of mouthpieces back then, the popular mouthpiece facings were like 0.70 to you know, 0.90. 0.90 was huge, which is, you know, became an Autolink 6, which is, you know, most people today, they can't play a 90 even. And that was really big back then. You know, we're talking about 4-star to 5 stars, probably the normal range that people were playing back then. And I mean, that's tiny. I mean, who plays a 4-star or 5-star today? Very few people. Most people just couldn't even figure out how to work that mouthpiece. But you know, when we listen to Coltrane, you know, you listen to Blue Train, which is 1957, right? I mean, he's playing on a Super Action, and he's got a large chamber Autolink Tone Master. Who knows, you know, what he put in it, whether a wax baffle or bubblegum or God knows what. He had it phased and did all kind of things to it. But I mean, that is bright. You know, he's got a really bright sound out of that. And he's playing, I mean, Train, you know, from all things I heard, never played anything bigger than a 6. It's small by today's standards, just tiny. So, you know, people today, most people couldn't even hang with that. They couldn't even figure out how to work that piece of equipment. The demands are so different. And so we can talk about how such and such horn is improved and the Mark VI is totally a piece of junk. We can do that, but if we're going to do that, you know, let's consider what the Mark VI was made for. It wasn't made for mouthpieces with a huge baffle and a tip opening of 118 or 130. I mean, it just, or 120 or whatever, 115 to 120 or whatever. A lot of people like to play that, like 110 to 120. These days, a lot of people like big sizes. And that's not what it was made for. So the air column may feel different. The response may come out totally different. It's a different time period. We can't just discount that when talking about the way the horn was designed. And so sometimes if people are making a video now and discussing their opinions on this matter now, saying, I've tried all these Mark VIs, they're not really very good. You know, what mouthpieces are they using on them? And do they understand the context in which for what the instrument was made and how it was designed? That's, what comes to my mind. There was another comment that was made on the metal wear, the key wear of the instrument, saying, the keys, the metal wears out, then the keys become loose, it'll never seal, blah, blah, blah. New horns don't have this problem. Of course they do. How do new horns not have this problem? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. Remember, the Selmer Mark VI was new when it was made in 1956. In 1960, they were new. And when they were made, their keys were tight too. And they were tight for quite a while until they got played a lot, and then they had metal wear. And then you know what? You fix them. You swedge them. You fit the keys. There's all kind of stuff you do when you restore a horn like that. Tighten up the keys, make the action nice and lovely. You know what happens after that? It plays tight for some years. If you set up a horn nice and tight and you swedge the key action, it's going to play well. If you play it a lot, you're going to wear it out. It's going to become loose again. Well, you know what happens if you buy a brand new 82Z right now and you take a vintage Mark VI that still has life left in it and you swedge and tighten up the key action, right? You got that nice new 82Z with the tight key action, or Yanagisawa with the tight key action, and you got your nice, 65,000 serial number Mark VI that you just restored with a nice tight key action, and you put them side by side, and you play them together for 5 years, they're going to wear at the same rate. So a new horn, if you play it a lot, the keys are also going to wear loose, okay? A vintage Mark VI, if you restore it and set up the keys, they're also going to wear loose. But just because it's a vintage horn doesn't mean it's any more prone to wearing than a new horn. That point is just not, that's a non-starter, okay? When you restore a vintage horn, like a Selmer 6 or Super Action or whatever it is, okay? You're going to swedge those keys, you're going to level the tones, do all that stuff. And the horn is going to feel wonderful. If the tech knows what they're doing, and I have to say, some people don't. Some people really don't, okay? There is a fair amount of shitty work out there, really. Okay, some people just don't know. Some people just haven't even learned. They never learned it anywhere. How would they know? Other people, maybe they know about it, they don't care. Okay, there's some shitty work out there. So, unfortunately, some of the people who are latecomers to the scene, haven't tried a lot of horns or don't have the experience or whatever it is, the horns they are trying, okay, those people who are like having a bitter experience on the internet, those people, some of them, the horns that they're getting exposed to have been in the hands of poor techs as well. Badly set up, missing details. There's a lot of fine adjustment that goes into it. And if that's what you're playing, if the horn if it hasn't been set up that well, then your exposure, you're going to play a horn, it's a little bit stuffy, a little bit messed up, doesn't project, it leaks here, it leaks there, or the keys are loose, it doesn't have any focus to it, then your opinion is altered, okay? But a horn like a Selmer Mark VI, it has a finite number of lives on it, okay? So you can play it for a number of years hard, and you can start to wear things out, and then it's going to need an overhaul. And you're going to do that. Maybe, you clean up the tone holes, you tighten up the key action, all that. And you can do that a certain number of times. And eventually it's like, you worn it out so many times, it's hard to do anymore. Like maybe the tone holes get too low. You can't, level them anymore. Well, you could pull them up, yeah, to a point, and you can, what are you going to do? Add another cylinder on top of it when it's all worn down to the body? I mean, they do have a finite life, but they got a lot of lives on them. I mean, there's a lot of horns that are really beat up, and you can still do another overhaul and bring them back to life. Eventually, you can't though. But that's true of new horns. It's just that things like the Yanagisawa, the Series 3 and the 82Z, and all those things, they haven't been around long enough to wear. It's not a specific character of vintage horns that they wear out faster than others. They don't. In fact, they may even wear out slower. The quality of the metal was good, and they've been around for 50, 60, 70 years, and they're still having lives rebuilt on them. So that point is a non-starter. Now, there's another comment. One of the guys said about how, he'd had the 6 or 7 Mark VIs or whatever, and then he got on other things. He's playing other horns, and now he's constantly playing different horns. You know, he's not going back to the Mark VI with the auto link. It's been years since he had the Mark VI with auto link, because he didn't want to sound like anybody else. He wanted to sound unique. Now, I respect that opinion. I appreciate that. I understand that, and he is entitled to that opinion. I disagree with it, though, in the sense that, I mean, he can do whatever, more power to him for playing whatever horn he wants. My personal opinion about that is, well, like, for example, myself, I think I sound very unique, and I'm not trying to praise myself. I sound unique because I can't help it. I mean, I spent years trying to sound like whatever I tried to sound like, and it's always like, I always end up I just sound this one way. I can't help it. You know, maybe that's a good thing, but, you know, for some, it could be a disappointment too. Maybe I wanted to sound like so-and-so, right? But I couldn't. I just sound this particular way, couldn't help it. Doesn't really sound like anybody else as far as I can. I listen to myself, I listen to other people. I'm like, all right, that just sounds like you again. I can't help it. And I think that sounding unique, sounding like yourself, sounding different from other people, should come just from you. It doesn't matter what horn you play. You know, I like vintage Selmers. I like them. But it's not because they make me sound unique or better. I mean, better maybe, but the point is, it's not the equipment in that way. I'm not saying equipment is not important, but I don't think it's important for that. For me, like, why do I like... I prefer Selmer Mark VI, but I have some other horns that I really like too. I just always end up back on 1 or 2 horns. But my point is that the horn you prefer, or for me, if it's a 6 or another Selmer or a King, whatever horn it is I prefer, I'm preferring it because it works well in the combination between the horn and the mouthpiece that I prefer, and my mouth, and the sound that I'm hearing. I want all that equipment to get out of the way, all right? I don't choose equipment because it makes me sound this or that way. I choose it because it gets out of the way and allows me to sound like myself. I think if you're choosing equipment to sound unique or to sound different from somebody else, I mean, that's not my opinion, okay? I mean, anybody else is welcome to do that or believe that. But myself, I think, you know, if you really sound unique, you shouldn't have to try to sound unique, and certainly it's not equipment for me that would do that. Equipment would get out of the way and let me sound unique. Do you understand my point? It's not, you know, you don't want to hunt for equipment to help yourself sound a particular way. That's like those, forgive me, I'm a Luddite, I'm old-fashioned, but that horrible music where people sing through auto-tune to make them sound a particular way, I mean, forgive me while I barf, but, you know, that's kind of the idea. It's like, oh, I want to sound unique. How about I audio process my sound? Well, for me personally, for us old school types, I mean, it's like, get the equipment that allows you to sound like you and to express the sound that you're hearing and that you're feeling. The right horn for you, if it's a Selmer or whatever, should respond in the way that gives you the feedback and the vibration that you need to sound like yourself. So, I mean, I'm not somebody who worships the Mark VI. I mean, I like vintage Selmers of all types. I also like King Super 20s and Silver Sonics. I like the 82C. I like a lot of horns. But I have a few Mark VIs, and I'm attached to certain vibrations. A lot of it is really like, what is good about a really good Mark VI is the feedback that it gives you. It's the way it feels with the mouthpiece and a horn and the air column and the pressure and the response. It feels a certain way. When the horn feels good to play and gives you a certain response, you can hear yourself better and you can play better. The horn isn't making you sound better. It's giving you feedback and allowing you to hear yourself better so you can play more naturally and sound like yourself. The uniqueness is you. If the equipment gets out of the way, you get to sound like you. If all your equipment got out of your way and was totally efficient and helped you, and you sounded like you, and it wasn't unique, well, then you are not unique. You are not a special snowflake. You need to work on that. But, I mean, everybody can be unique with a lot of practice. You're going to sound like you. You know? unfortunately for some people, sounding like you may sound like shit, but I can't help that. You know, you're going to sound like you. Work on it, you know, practice, and you'll sound like you. Get some life experience that's not just in the mainstream, you know, like they used to say, like Charlie Parker said, you know, you have to live it. Get some life experience and maybe if sounding like you is not unique, or if it's boring, then, you know, get some life experience and make you more interesting. And then, you know, being unique will have more value. But just for fun. So, I mean, you know, they're talking about Mark VIs and how they're not all that. Well, this is my favorite horn at the moment, okay? This is an 87,000 Mark VI. And serial numbers matter. They matter, okay? When I watched that video, it's like all the horns they pulled up had been, you know, some of them looked like they'd been through the ringer. They you know, cats have 9 lives, so they say. Well, horns may have, I don't know, 32 or whatever it is. But some of those horns look like they were on life number 31 or, you know, 30 or 28. They're kind of getting down the line there. Some of them have been beat up, and some of them have been restored, you know, and some of them are really late numbers. I mean, the Mark VI is really, they really vary. You know, when you're going to compare a Mark VI 160,000 to a 70,000, I mean, that's a wide gap. That's wide. Those horns are, it's like the difference is really, really big. You know, 160, 170, that's usually a pretty compact and bright horn that's fairly generic by comparison, okay? They can be kind of thin. It can be good, but they're just not, they're not a wowzer for the most part. I mean, I haven't played those later horns. It's like, wow, that really has a, you know, complex sparkle. They don't. They're different. They're a little more generic. You compare it to a 70,000, I mean, 70,000, that's a crapshoot. 70,000, that early period. So the first period of the Mark VI, you're talking about 1954, basically 55,000 Mark VI is when they start transitional ones. It's half super action, half Mark VI. You know, to get to 55,000, then 56,000 is usually a true Mark VI, but the body tube is very similar to super action. So the first Mark VI, 56,000, I mean, they're Mark VIs, but if you were to compare that to this 87,000, that's a huge, huge difference. Different models, totally different model. But those early ones, you know, they tend to be fairly bright and kind of spread, you know, wide, kind of bouncy spread, brightness with a mellow warmth underneath. And that sort of progresses into the early 60,000s. And, you know, maybe to like 65 or whatever. When you start to get to 66, 67, and it's approaching the cusp of the 70,000s, they made a change. And they did something, and they start experimenting with the 70,000. They want to improve something. And generally speaking, the early 70,000, late 60 and early 70 tend to get a little more focused. And then you don't know. It could be bright, it could be dark, it could be really narrow and focused, or they could be spread and really dark. They were doing a lot of experimentation back then. And you know, some people are going to play those horns and say, well, that's really terrible or whatever. But the thing is, if you're going to evaluate the Selmer Mark VI, first you've got to think about what period was it made in. And second of all, it's like, what are you looking for in a horn? Some people, they want a really bright horn. And other people, you know, really want a dark horn. And some people like spread, some people like focused. And let's say you pick up a really dark horn. You say, oh, that's really a piece of shit. You know, it's terrible. Well, some other guy who he's got some really high baffle mouthpiece and he wants a balance. He's going to play this, oh, this is great. It's dark. It balances out my mouthpiece. And that's what it is. It's a tool, you know? It's not just good or bad. I mean, some horns are bad if they're messed up, or maybe it was just like, okay, a failed design experiment. That does happen. But I mean, so it's like I've had a 70,000, which was, I mean, it was a dead duck. That horn was like dark and stuffy. It was like, my friend and I, we call it constipated. It's a constipated horn. And it's, you know, it's horrible. To me, it's horrible. Somebody else will play that thing and say, wow, that's great. It gives me back pressure. It lets me play bright and gives me balance. You know, maybe some horns that just messed up. They were doing experiments. But at the same time, so I had one, it's a dead duck, it's dark, it's spread, it doesn't project. It's just, you know, yuck, right? And then I had a 71,000, which was so bright and so narrow that it was like too narrow for me. You know, for me, because I like mouthpieces that provide a certain kind of focus. And then for me, that horn was like, but I gigged on that horn for some years and it did great and it was a wonderful sound. right? But then eventually it was like, okay, it's not working for a particular mouthpiece thing that I'm going for. It wasn't cooperating with the mouthpiece. So I moved it on. But, somebody's going to come in there with a large chamber mouthpiece that has, the mouthpiece provides a lot of spread and complexity of tone. And they're going to put it on that narrow rocket of a horn, and the thing's going to open up. It's going to make that narrow horn spread, and it's going to achieve balance and give that player the feedback that they want. So to sit there and say this one was bad and this one was good, that's not accurate. It's really about which combination do you like and who is it going to work for. Different horns going to work for different people. That early 70,000 period is a lot of experimentation. And then they go up to, you get to mid 70s, 74, 75, and then from 75 on to 79. And those horns, now they become more consistent, and they're slightly compact with a bit of spread, and they're bright and aggressive. Great horns. The early 70s, there were some great ones too. You just can't tell. You don't know what you're getting. It's complicated. But the late 70s, like, those things it's a bat out of hell, right? And then you get to like 80, the 80 number, early 80. Everybody says, oh, 80 is a magical number. Well, okay. The early 80s, they're more spread than the late 70s. Early 80 gets lush and spread, and it's a very big sound. They're not the brightest, and they're not the darkest either, but they're lush and they're broad, and they're just monstrous, big sound. But for the people who want to attack and project in a really aggressive sound, and they've bought into the 80,000 thing, 80,000, amazing number, they're going to buy that early 80,000 horn, and if they're playing a big chamber mouthpiece, they're going to be like, it's sluggish, it's tubby, right? Somebody else who's playing a bat out of hell mouthpiece is going to put on that lush 80,000 and achieve complex balance, okay? Then you're going to get to the mid 80,000s, and in the mid 80,000s, then they start to focus them up and brighten them up, and that's like the Brecker horn. That's the 87,000, right? They get brighter, they become very powerful and just mid focus. Most horns in the mid 80s and whatever, it's like hard to even. They're pretty consistent. They do have differences between them, but they all do a certain thing, and that certain thing is what certain people like. But other people, they'll find it's too limiting. Maybe they want something more lush, something more warm, something more organic sounding, whatever. With their mouthpiece, it's just not achieving balance. After the 80s, late 80s, you get into the 90s, and again, there's some changes in the 90s. The 90s, 90 to 100,000, they can still do the same thing that the late 80s do, but they could be more lush here or there. It can be more bright, more focused here or there. It's changing. That's sort of a transitional period, and then you get to 100 to 110. That period, those horns tend to be punchy, focused, very loud, aggressive, and still complex. And then you get to sort of like 110 to 120 something. Those tend to be even more consistent. It's like Coltrane's Mark VI was 122 or something like that. Those tend to be, moderate focused and, adequately bright. They're a balanced, even horn that still has enough of the vintage stuff from before it, but sort of heading towards the modern. When you get into the 130s, they start to become more spread. 130s are more lush, generally speaking, more lush, more spread, not as much attack. And then 140, attack comes back. They become edgy, they're not narrow. They're still kind of broad, but they're so edgy and buzzy and brighter, and then they're losing complexity in the underbelly of the tone. They're losing complexity. You get to 150, it's kind of gone. 160, it's over. They still be good horns, but they don't have that vintage complexity. And 170, that's it. 170 to 170 to 200 something thousand. And they're super consistent at that period. It can be very, very good horns. 160 onward, they can be very, very good, and they're very consistent. But they're just not particularly. They're a little bit generic. They're not particularly complex or deep or vintage sounding anymore. So there's a lot of different periods, and you need to keep that in mind. Now, each horn is different. You can't rely on it. You can't say, well, this horn was an 83 and I played it and it was like this, so I'm going to get another 83 and it's going to be just like that. It won't. You tried this one, 83,000. It was like, wow, that was great. And you tried this other one. It's like, man, that's too focused, or it's too this, or it's too that. It's not as bright as that one was. They're all different. The point I wanted to make, though, is relating to the video and the discussion, is they're all different, but the differences aren't random. It's not just like it could be anything. No, it couldn't be anything. It can be anything within a particular range. So when you look at an 87,000 like this one, I have a couple of them, and one of them's for sale, and the other one is different than this. Okay, the other 87 is just, it's different, but it's not completely different. It's 87,000 different, meaning it's a little more of, this one's a little more this way, and that one's a little more that way, both within the range of what that design model is like. So if you look at, you look at a 60,000 tenor. I mean, they have a particular they have particular kind of tonal colors that they were making at that time, air pressure that they were making at the time. And you compare, well, this 60,000 to this 60,000. It's like, all right, this is a little warmer than that one, or this one has a little more bite than that one, or this one's a little more focused than that one. But they inherently sound kind of similar based on the model designs of the time. They're kind of similar, and they have their differences. They're different. They're different within a range. Okay, 75,000 Mark VIs. I mean, they sound pretty similar. There's just a little difference here, a little difference there. That difference can be big for some people. Anyhow, to end this video, so this is just to start a discussion. I'm happy to talk about such vintage horns with people. I deal with this stuff all the time, but it's really just to clear up some misconceptions. If you have played a lot of Mark VIs and a lot of super actions and vintage Selmers, I mean, you'll get an idea of the larger pattern of how the things were designed. It's not random. They weren't just like throwing a plate of pasta at the wall and see what sticks. It's not like that. It's a gradual progression. And then within the different ranges, there's experimentation, and there were changes made to see what happened. And they respond differently, but it's not just random. So I'm going to start off. This is my number one. This is my 87,000, and I've had this for years. And I'm just right now I'm enjoying this on a vintage link that I restored that I like right now, and just because it's just like what I'm comfortable on. It gets out of the way and lets me express my own sound. It gives me the feedback I need. So I don't know what number of lives this horn is on. I think this horn is on life number 2. When I got this, I bought it from an antique shop, an antique store. It wasn't a woodwind store at all. It was a junker lying in an antique store, and it had original pads, moldy, rotted original pads with old plastic resonators, and it had a few dents. And I had big restoration done on this. Ernie Sola did this one for me years back. And, put the big metal resonators on it and really nice pads and redid everything. And I think it's just life number 2. It's probably never had an overhaul before that. So how many lives does it have on it? A lot. I've done a little to it over the years since he worked on it. But I mean, this has got a lot of life left on it. But it also depends how you treat it. But listening to this horn, I mean, you know, good luck improving on it. I mean, these are hotly desired for a reason. Now, I've played some great modern horns, and I'm like, oh, that's great. They tapped into a little bit of what this has. But has anybody done better? Not that I've played. Now, they could. Now, if I was traveling, you know, international touring musician, would I be taking this on the plane? No. So I would buy something that improved on it, that was cheap, that I could take on the plane. The strap is short. I gotta change the strap. There we go. That will do it. Yeah. Good luck improving on that. I'll keep my money waiting in the bank for who comes out with something better. Now let's compare it to this one. This is a 98,000. And it is different. This horn has never had an overhaul, okay? It's got original pads, original plastic resonators. Not the perfect setup. I mean, it's old. You know, 60 years old or something. Never had an overhaul. So it's going to play different for sure. But it's also a slightly different design, though not entirely random. I don't know. Doesn't sound worn out to me. Now let's add something different to the mix. Here's a Super Action SBA 48,000. Original. It's had an overhaul. It's got metal resonators. You know, what is it, 1952 or something like that? So 1952 compared to, you know, the last one was probably 1961, right? Probably 1961. And then before that, the 87,000 is 1960. So this is going back to 1952 or 53. Well, anyway, now I don't even know what I'm trying to say because I played a few really cool horns and my cerebral cognitive abilities have kind of blown up because now I'm just feeling sound and it's hard to talk. So, but that's, a little look at a few vintage Selmers and some of my ideas. For those who are hunting for vintage horns, I understand that it's difficult and that many of us don't have access to the information. We don't have the experience and the access to the horns to make an informed decision as to what is what. But that doesn't mean you need to watch YouTube videos and listen to any kind of opinion that's out there and just, okay, if they told me that. It's not, it's not necessarily like that. Many of these horns, if they're set up nicely, they're going to have their own unique response, and they do have a response within a range based on a model period. And they have many lives on them. In the hands of the right technician, the sparkle and the life can be brought out of them. The problem is that many of them aren't set up that way. Many of them have undisclosed, unknown damage. There's a lot of factors, okay? So it's hard now to buy a vintage Selmer and know what you're getting without the experience. It's hard. It's not impossible. It's hard. But that doesn't mean that they all suck or that the Mark VI is overrated. Or that who cares about the Mark VI? I don't care. I'm not somebody who ever said, it's a Mark VI, it must be great. I mean, that type of attitude that the Mark VI is the best thing in the world, I don't get into that at all. I generally look at horns as individuals. I think that certain periods of Mark VIs work really well for me. Here's a super action. This would also work well for me with a particular mouthpiece or whatever. I think it's about relationships between different pieces of equipment, and I don't think... So, we have a thing, people say, they talk about the straw man argument, where you set up a straw man, light it on fire so you can burn it down. Meaning, you make an argument based on something that no one ever said. Now, are there people out there that are saying the Mark VI is the best horn ever? Yes, there are. It's just not true. So, to put up a big argument against that is kind of... it's like that. I don't think that argument is being made by the people in the know. Let's put it that way. The Mark VI, the production run is so long that it's really impossible to say the Mark VI is the best thing ever, because there isn't a the. There's many. So there are certain Mark VIs or certain periods of Mark VIs that are great, and they might be the best thing ever. But that just doesn't cover all of the rest of them. When you say, an 85,000 Mark VI is amazing, and that's a great, model of horn, you can't equate that with a 220,000 Mark VI as if they're the same creature. They're not even the same thing. So it doesn't make sense to say the Mark VI is this or that, okay? So we can just dispel that. There are certain periods of Mark VI which are definitely all they're cracked up to be. And, they live up to the hype. And then there are others which is like, okay, it just happens to be in the model run, but it's not the same design. So in a sense, it's kind of a straw man argument. There isn't really, for anybody who knows, there isn't a claim being made that all Mark VIs are just this thing and they're all the best ever. It's easy to take that down. It's just not true at all. So I don't think a big deal needs to be made out of that topic. I never bought into that. When I first got a Mark VI, I didn't know anything about the Mark VI. I was playing a balanced action, I think. Yeah, I think I had a balanced action, and I traded it for Mark VI. At that time it was too vintage for me to handle. I couldn't get the sound I wanted out of it because of where I was. A balanced action is a great horn, but at that moment I couldn't do that with the mouthpiece and the experience that I had. So I traded for Mark VI because it was newer. He says, "Oh, this is a Mark VI," and I was like, "Great, okay," but I wasn't like, "Wow, Mark VI." With the Mystique, what did I care? It was probably like 1987 or something. What did I care? I didn't care. I didn't know Mark VI from anything. It was a newer Selmer, and it sounded good, and that was good enough, So I never bought into that Mystique, and I don't think anybody else needs to either. You don't need to believe the Mark VI is a magic model name, and you don't need to say the Mark VI is not any good. You need to look into the model run if you want to know this stuff, and then make a more intelligent decision about what these things are based on the complexity of the design and all that. Anyway, though the video's getting long, those are my opinions for now, and I hope they help somebody. And if not, well, then I just took up server space in a server farm somewhere, and when I could have been practicing. And best of luck to you. Thanks for watching.